For 25 years, the crown of Embermere sat on the head of a man who was never meant to wear one. Malcolm had been born into the House of Starfell, in the cold court of Duskrain. A second son, then a third, never close enough to that throne to be counted among the names that mattered. He was still young when he came to Embermere and met the woman who would change the entire shape of his life. Sophie was born to it. The only daughter of a line 6 generations deep, raised from childhood to understand that the kingdom would one day answer to her and to no one else. He married her, and the kingdom rose for both of them. The early years were good ones. Good enough that no one who watched them together back then would have believed anything could unmake it. 2 sons were born within those years, Kieran and Redok, the promise of a line that would carry Embermere forward long after either of them was gone. But 25 years is a long time to hold a crown that was never his by right. And somewhere in the later ones, a man who had once been grateful simply to be counted began to believe he had built all of it alone. Gratitude has a short memory when it is fed for long enough by a title, especially when ego takes place. Sophie did not see it happening. Or perhaps she saw it and chose for years not to look directly at it, the way one avoids looking directly at anything that might demand a response too large to take back. She would not have that choice much longer. She was not ready for what was coming. Few people ever are, when the life they built quietly begins to end. But circumstance has a way of revealing what a person was capable of long before they believed it themselves. And Sophie Embermere was about to learn exactly what she had been ready for, all along. Chapter 1. 25 years had taught Sophie Embermere how to read a room before she understood why it had gone quiet. This one had gone quiet the moment Malcolm entered. She sat where she always sat, at his right hand, the seat that had been hers since before he wore the crown at all. The hall was full, nobles from 3 provinces, envoys from Duskrain, the household staff pressed along the far wall the way they were pressed for every formal announcement. She had expected a trade agreement. He had told her as much that morning, distracted, already dressed. He had not told her the rest. The doors opened at the back of the hall, and a woman walked the length of it alone. Young, dark-haired, dressed in a shade of blue too fine for a guest and too deliberate to be accidental. Sophie watched the court's attention shift toward her, the way a held breath shifts toward release, and she understood, before Malcolm said a single word, that everyone else in the room had known this was coming. Everyone but her. "This is Mariska," Malcolm announced, and his voice carried the ease of a man reading a weather report. "She will be joining the royal household in a formal capacity, effective immediately." No one asked in what capacity. No one needed to. Sophie did not move. She had spent 2 decades learning what stillness could do in rooms like this one. How it read as strength when panic would have read as confirmation. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She kept her spine straight. She let the silence around her settle into something the court could interpret however it needed to. Malcolm did not look at her. That was the detail she would return to later, in the dark, when she allowed herself to feel any of it. Not the announcement. Not the woman in blue, standing where a guest should have stood nervous and stood instead like she already belonged. It was that he had not looked at her once. Not to check, not to warn, not even out of the old habit of a man glancing at his wife before doing something significant. He had simply stopped accounting for her in the room. She thought of the day the crown had been placed on his head. She had been the one standing beside him then too, and everyone in this same hall had risen for both of them. For her, first, if she was honest, because she had been the one they'd known since birth, the daughter of the house, the name the kingdom had been built around for 6 generations. Malcolm had risen with her, married into a crown he had never been born to inherit. She wondered, watching him now, if he remembered that. If he had ever, in 25 years, let himself remember it fully. The court began to murmur. Not about her, around her, like rivers moving around a stone that has stopped being an obstacle worth noting. She caught Lord Keswick's eye for a moment, and he looked away first, faster than he would have a year ago. That told her something too. She stood before the murmuring could grow into anything with a shape. If the trade envoys from Duskrain would prefer to continue this discussion tomorrow, she stated, I imagine they've had a long journey. It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence that gave the room something to do with its discomfort, and the envoys took it gratefully, gathering themselves toward the doors. Malcolm said nothing to stop her. He did not need to. He had already said what he came to say. Mariska remained standing where she'd been placed, and for one small moment, brief enough that Sophie almost missed it, the young woman's composure faltered. Not guilt. Something closer to uncertainty, quickly folded away. Sophie filed that away too. She was not yet sure what it meant. She only knew, walking out of the hall with her back straight and her pace unhurried, that something had changed that could not be walked back. Not the marriage, that had been failing quietly for longer than she wanted to admit. Something larger. The room itself had recalibrated around a new center of gravity, and she was no longer standing in it. She did not cry until she reached her garden. The garden had no name that appeared on any map of Embermere, and no gardener claimed responsibility for it. It existed the way old things exist, unquestioned, uncatalogued, simply there. Behind a wall most of the castle had stopped noticing generations ago. Sophie had been coming here since before she could remember choosing to. The roses grew in a color no one had ever successfully explained. Not the blue of sky or sea, but something closer to dusk caught and held past its hour. Deep, quiet, faintly luminous where the late light touched the petals. Thorns ran the length of every stem, ungentled by anything anyone had ever done to the garden. It was not the kind of place that asked to be tamed. She sat on the same stone bench she had sat on as a girl, when this had been the only place in the castle where no one needed anything from her. She did not cry the way the halls had expected her to, somewhere behind the doors she'd already closed. She cried the way a person cries when no one is watching and nothing needs to be performed, without shape, without grace. Her hands pressed flat against the stone, as if the cold of it could hold something in place that wanted to come apart. A weight settled against her leg before she heard him arrive. Samkiel had a way of appearing that made the question of where he'd come from feel beside the point. His fur held that same impossible blue in patches along his spine and tail, vivid tonight, deep as the roses themselves, his eyes matching in a shade too clear to belong to any ordinary animal. He did not announce himself. He simply arrived, the way the garden itself seemed to arrive around whoever needed it, and pressed his weight into her side until she moved her hand to accommodate him. He asked nothing of her. That, more than anything else in the castle, was the whole of his value. She did not know how old he was. No one did. Her father used to say he'd been old when he himself was a boy running barefoot along these same stone paths. Her sons had grown up believing the garden cat belonged to no one and everyone in equal measure. The garden's cat, never the queen's, though she had been the one who came here most. Tonight she said nothing to him. She had never needed to. She thought of Malcolm's face in the hall. Not angry, not even cold, simply arranged around the business of the day, as though she were a matter already settled and filed away. She thought of the woman in blue, standing where a guest should have stood nervous. She thought of the 25 years that had led to a room going silent the moment he walked into it, and how much of that silence had belonged to her long before tonight. The roses did not care what had happened in the hall. They had never cared what crown sat on whose head, or which treaties passed through which hands, or what the court decided to notice and what it decided to overlook. They cared only that she had come, the way she always eventually came, back to the one place that had never once asked her to prove she deserved to be here. She stayed until the light went entirely, Samkiel a solid warmth against her side. When she finally rose, something in her already knew the night was not finished with her, though she could not have said how or why, only that she left the way a person leaves a room they will need to return to sooner than expected. When she was about to leave, the roses nearest her leaned fractionally inward. Not the wind. There was no wind that night. She had never been able to explain this peculiar connection. She had stopped trying years ago. The garden did not console her. It simply refused to let her grieve alone. And some nights, that was the more honest kindness. Tomorrow would not be easier than today. She already knew that much. The council chamber had a rhythm she could have recited in her sleep. 25 years of entering that room had taught her its exact geometry, where the light fell in the morning, which lord sat closest to power and which sat closest to the door, and the small automatic courtesy that had greeted her arrival every single time since she was old enough to sit at that table in her own right. Long before she'd worn a wedding ring, they rose when she entered. All of them. It was not a rule written anywhere. It was simply what happened, the way water finds its level. An acknowledgement older than Malcolm's crown, older than the marriage, older than anything that had happened in the hall 2 nights before. She pushed open the doors without ceremony, already halfway into the first item of business in her mind. No one rose this time. She registered it the way one registers a missed step in the dark. Not pain yet, just the body's sudden understanding that the ground was not where it was supposed to be. Lord Keswick glanced up from his papers and gave her the smallest nod, the kind offered to a guest arriving slightly late to a meal already underway. Lord Aldrich did not look up at all. 2 of the younger council members, men she had known since they were boys following their fathers through these same halls, kept their eyes fixed on the table between them, their focus deliberate enough that she understood, without being told, what posture the room had decided to require of them today. She took her seat. It cost her something to make the motion look unremarkable. "We were discussing the grain tariffs with dusk grain," Keswick said, sliding a paper toward the center of the table, toward Malcolm rather than toward her, though the matter had been hers to oversee for the better part of a decade. His Majesty had some thoughts on adjusting the terms. Malcolm did not look up either. He was already speaking, already deep in a sentence about export quotas, and it took Sophie a moment to understand that he was not being cruel. He had simply stopped expecting her to need including. She let him finish. She had learned over the years the difference between a fight worth having and a fight that cost more than it returned, and this specific quiet erosion, was not yet a fight. It was something smaller, and she was beginning to understand, more dangerous. A fight could be won. This could only be noticed, slowly, by everyone in the room, until noticing it became agreement. "The terms as proposed favor Duskrain's harvest cycle over ours," she said when he paused. "If we're adjusting quotas, we should adjust the collection schedule to match, or we'll be shipping grain we haven't finished threshing." It was correct. It was, in fact, the exact objection that would have been raised eventually, expensively, after someone signed something that shouldn't have been signed. She watched Keswick make a note. She watched Malcolm consider it for a moment longer than he needed to. Not because the point required thought, she realized, but because acknowledging it meant acknowledging her, and some new arithmetic in the room had made that cost something it hadn't cost a year ago. "Noted," Malcolm said, and moved on. She sat through the rest of the session with her spine as straight as it had been in the hall 2 nights before, contributing where the matter demanded it, watching the room absorb her contributions without quite crediting them to her. It did not announce itself the way the hall had, but she understood, watching Aldrich's eyes stay fixed on the table long after there was any reason for them to, that this was the version of the wound that would outlast the other. Betrayals ended. This, the slow collective decision of a room to stop rising, could go on for years if she let it, She did not decide anything that morning. She only understood, walking out of the chamber at the session's end, that something had been quietly finalized without her consent, and that whatever came next would have to begin with the fact that she had noticed. A letter arrived 3 days later, carried by a page who would not meet her eyes when he handed it over. Sophie recognized the seal before she broke it, Malcolm's, pressed into wax the color he had never once bothered to change in 25 years, though she'd suggested it once, early on, half as a joke. She had almost forgotten she'd made the suggestion. He clearly had not, given how deliberately the same old seal now closed something that felt, from its weight alone, like it would cost her something. It did. The eastern wing, her wing, the rooms that had been hers since before the wedding, the ones that still held her mother's writing desk, and the window seat where she'd nursed both her sons through fevers, was being reassigned. Renovations, the letter said. Necessary structural work that could not accommodate her presence during the coming months. Alternative accommodations had already been arranged in the older quarter of the castle near the servants' stair, in rooms that had not been aired in a decade. She read it twice, standing in the doorway of the very rooms in question, and understood immediately that no renovation had been commissioned. She would have known. She oversaw every commission that touched the castle's structure. She had for years. This was not repair. This was removal, dressed carefully enough to survive being questioned. She sat at her mother's desk, still hers, for now, for however many days remained before someone came to move it, and let herself feel the shape of what he'd done. He had not thrown her out. He would never do something so visible, so easily named by the court as cruelty. He had simply made the ground beneath her a little less solid, a little less hers, in a way no single person could point to and call unjust. It was, she thought, an unusually efficient kind of unkindness, the kind that left no fingerprints. She thought of the council chamber, of the silence that had followed her into it, of Mariska's composure faltering for half a second in the hall and then folding itself away, as though someone had coached her on exactly how much uncertainty was permissible to show. She thought of years compressed suddenly into the plain fact sitting in front of her, a letter reassigning her own bedroom, sealed by a man who no longer needed to ask. She did not weep this time. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had already spent whatever tears this humiliation might once have earned. What she felt instead was quieter and colder and far more useful. She thought of Kieran, 22 now, old enough to be spoken of seriously as an heir, careful and steady in the way his father had never quite managed to be. If this was the direction things were moving, if Malcolm intended to make her position smaller by degrees until there was nothing left to make smaller, then the succession could not be left to chance, or to the slow accumulation of small cruelties dressed as renovation. It needed protection. It needed allies who owed nothing to Malcolm and everything to the strength of Embermere's future. She thought of Everwind, of King Logan, whom she had never met, but whose reputation preceded him in every report that crossed her desk. A ruler respected on both sides of the border, widowed some years past, and by every account she trusted, a man who kept his word. She drew a fresh sheet of paper toward her before she allowed herself time to reconsider it. To His Majesty, King Logan of Everwind, she began, and stopped, and started again, more carefully this time, because this letter, unlike the one she'd just set aside, would need to say exactly what it meant. By the time she sealed it, the light outside had shifted from afternoon into something closer to evening, and the old writing desk that would soon no longer be hers held, for the first time in longer than she could name, a decision that belonged entirely to her. Sophie went to the garden the night before she was meant to leave for Everwind, though she told herself, walking there, that she had come only to say she would be gone a while. The roses had already begun their evening fold, petals drawing in against the coming dark, and the air held that hush the garden seemed to keep in reserve for hours when the rest of the castle had gone quiet around its own business. She sat where she always sat. The stone was cold enough, this late in the season, to make itself known through the fabric of her dress. Samkill found her before she'd been there a full minute, settling against her side with the unhurried certainty of something that had never once needed to be summoned. She had packed for the journey that morning. Modest traveling clothes, the correspondence she'd need, a small case of documents outlining Embermere's succession law in language precise enough to withstand argument. She had rehearsed more than once exactly how she would present the matter to a king she had never met. Protect the succession, secure the boy's future, keep the throne from becoming a prize fought over by lesser men once Malcolm's negligence finally caught up with him. It was a good plan. It was also, she was beginning to suspect, not entirely honest, though she could not yet have said what it was leaving out. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said out loud, to no one. The words startled her more than she expected. She had not planned to say them. They had simply arrived, the way certain truths only arrive once a person has run out of other things to say first. And once they were spoken, she found she could not take them back, or soften them, or pretend they belonged to someone braver. In all these years of marriage, she had known exactly who she was. Malcolm's queen, Kieran and Rydok's mother, the steady hand behind every treaty that mattered, the woman the council trusted to catch what the king overlooked. Every one of those things had required her to stand slightly behind something else, a marriage, a title, a son not yet grown into his own authority. She had never once in her entire life needed to ask what she was when none of those things were holding her up. She was asking now. Samkiel shifted against her, his weight a small, steady insistence that she was not, in this moment, entirely alone. She thought of the letter she had sent to Everwind, already answered, already arranging the shape of what lay ahead. She thought of the eastern wing, half emptied now, her mother's desk moved to a smaller room near the old servants' stair. She thought of a council chamber that no longer rose for her, and a hall where a woman in blue had stood exactly where she'd been placed. None of it, she realized, sitting in the dark with the roses folding closed around her, was the true shape of the loss. The wing could be reclaimed. The council could be reminded. Even Malcolm's negligence, given enough time and the right allies, could be corrected or outlasted. What she did not know how to reclaim was the version of herself that had existed before any of it, the girl who had run these same paths without a crown to protect, or a husband to manage, or two sons whose futures rested, however she moved, on the choices she made next. She was not certain, sitting there, that a woman could return to something she had spent years of her life walking away from a little at a time. She only knew that tomorrow she would leave for Everwind, carrying a plan built entirely around protecting her son's claim to a throne she had never once, in all these years, allowed herself to consider as her own. The garden gave no answers. It never had. It only ever showed her, in its own quiet way, what already existed inside her, waiting to be looked at directly. But when she finally rose to go, one last bloom near the path let its petals fall behind her. Quiet, unremarked, gone before she reached the door. Everwind announced itself long before the carriage reached its gates, not in banners or fanfare, but in something like fresh sea air, the salt, bright light silvering the coastline in a way Embermere's inland valleys never quite managed. Sophie watched it unfold through the window and found herself, despite everything, briefly and uselessly calmed by it. She had prepared for this meeting like no other. She understood the weight of what she carried, and the weight of every word she intended to use. She had not prepared for the throne room itself to feel so unlike the one she'd left. It was smaller than Embermere's, warmer somehow, despite the same gray northern stone. King Logan rose from his seat when she entered, not the practiced half-motion of a man observing protocol, but something closer to genuine attention, as though her arrival were the thing he'd been waiting for that morning rather than an item on a longer list. Queen Sophie. He said it plainly, without the flourish courts usually attached to her name when they wanted something from her. "Thank you for making the journey. I understand it wasn't a short one." "It wasn't," she agreed, and took the seat he offered rather than the one protocol would have assigned her, closer to the fire than the formal distance a foreign monarch might have expected her to keep. She had rehearsed her opening for most of the ride north. She delivered it now, cleanly, laying out Embermere's succession law, the boys' claims, the quiet erosion she had watched building around her for the better part of a year. Careful to frame it all as a matter of stability, of protecting a line that mattered to more than her own household. She did not mention the Eastern Wing. She did not mention Mariska by name. She kept the account precise, useful, entirely reasonable. Logan listened to all of it without interrupting once. She was not used to that. Malcolm had never, in recent years, let her finish an argument uninterrupted, not out of malice, she understood now, but simply because he had never needed to. A king did not have to wait his turn in his own hall. She realized, watching Logan wait through the entire length of her explanation, how rare that silence actually was, and how much it had cost her all these years to keep speaking into rooms that assumed she'd finish soon enough to let someone else talk. When she was done, he did not answer immediately either. "You've built a strong case for your son," he said finally. "Precise, well argued, the kind of case that wins a room. Thank you. May I ask you something?" She inclined her head, expecting a question about troop numbers or timing, or which lords in Embermere could be counted among his allies. "Why are you fighting for your son's right to the throne?" he said, "and not your own?" The question landed somewhere she had not braced for. She opened her mouth to answer the way she'd have answered anyone else. Because Kieran is the heir. Because that is how succession works. Because it was never a question that required asking. And found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the answer would not come easily. "Because he's the heir," she said instead, and heard, even as she said it, how thin it sounded in a room that had not rushed to fill the silence for her. Logan did not press further. He let the sentence sit between them, unchallenged, the way he seemed to let most things sit before deciding what to do with them. And something about that patience unsettled her more than an argument would have. "I'll consider your request seriously," he said after a moment. "Embermere's stability matters to Everwind as much as it matters to you. But I'd ask you to consider something too, while you're here." "What's that?" "Whether the case you just made is the one you actually believe." She did not have an answer for that either. She thanked him, rose when the audience ended, and walked out into the pale northern light with a question lodged somewhere she had not known was empty enough to hold one. She was summoned back to Everwind's Hall the following morning. Not for a formal audience this time, but for what Logan's steward called, without further explanation, a continuation of yesterday's conversation. She found him standing at a long table covered in maps, Embermere's borders marked in a hand she didn't recognize, notations in the margin she assumed were his own. He looked up when she entered, and did not bother with the pleasantries that had opened their first meeting. "I've been thinking about your case," he started. "And?" "It's sound. Kieran's claim is legitimate. Everwind would support it without hesitation, if that's the path you choose." Something in the phrasing caught her before she could name why. "If." He set down the paper he'd been holding. "May I ask you something else?" She had not forgotten his question from the day before. It had followed her through the guest quarters overnight, through a restless hour before dawn she'd spent staring at a ceiling that was not her own. She still did not have an answer for it. She was not certain she wanted a second one. "You may." "Why does the succession fall to your son at all?" "Because he's the heir," she said again, the same answer, though this time it left her mouth with less conviction than it had the day before. "Is he?" She frowned. "Embermere's line passes through blood," Logan said. "Not through marriage, not through whoever happens to be sitting on the throne when the crown was placed there." He came around the table, unhurried, the way he seemed to approach most things. "Your husband became king because he married the heir to Embermere. That's the entire foundation of his claim. It was never his by birth. I know that. Then answer me honestly. If Malcolm's claim runs through you..." He paused, letting the sentence find its own weight. "Why doesn't yours?" She had no argument ready. She had arguments for everything. She had built her entire adult life on having them ready, precise, unassailable. And she stood in a foreign king's hall with nothing to offer except the silence he seemed so willing to let stretch between them. "I gave that up a long time ago," she said finally. "Gave it up, or never claimed it. The distinction should not have mattered. It mattered enormously." She thought of her wedding. More than 20 years gone now, The crown lowered onto Malcolm's head while she stood beside him in a gown the color of Embermere's banner. And how naturally everyone in that hall, herself included, had already begun speaking of him as king and of her as something adjacent to that, something that supported it rather than was it. She thought of every year since. Every room she had entered as the power behind someone else's throne, never once as the throne itself. "You're not asking me to fight for my son," she said slowly, understanding it as she spoke it. "You're asking me why I never thought to fight for myself." "No," Logan said. "I'm telling you something you've spent a long time refusing to hear." He crossed the last of the distance between them, close enough now that she could see he was not performing the moment, not building toward some grand declaration, simply saying plainly what he believed to be true. "The first heir of Embermere is standing in front of me," he said. "She has been the entire time. Everyone in your husband's court simply agreed, a long time ago, not to say it out loud." The room went very quiet. She did not answer him. She could not yet. The words he'd offered were too large to accept standing upright, in a stranger's hall, with the ink of her son's succession case still drying on the table behind her. But something in her chest had shifted its position, the way a stone shifts when the water beneath it finally finds a way around instead of through. She thought, absurdly, of the garden, of a single bloom letting go of itself the night before she left. She wondered for the first time whether it had known something she hadn't yet let herself understand. "I need time," she said, when she could finally speak. "You have it," Logan said. "Take whatever you need. I'm not asking you to decide anything today." She left Everwin's hall that afternoon carrying a different question than the one she had arrived with. No longer how do I secure my son's throne, but one she had spent a lifetime too careful, or too tired, or too certain of her own smallness to ever let herself ask. What if it was never his to secure at all? The road home was longer than the road north had felt, though the distance hadn't changed. Sophie spent most of it in silence, watching Everwin's coastline give way, mile by mile, to Embermere's familiar hills, carrying a question she still hadn't found the shape to answer. She went to the garden before she went anywhere else. It was there, more than in any hall or council chamber, that her thoughts seemed to find their proper direction. Not answers exactly, but a kind of clearing, as though the roses simply made room for whatever needed to settle. Samkiel was waiting on the path when she arrived, as if he'd known the hour of her return before she did. She sat with him a while, saying nothing, and noticed, for the first time in longer than she could name, a cluster of blooms near the east wall she hadn't seen open in years. She did not ask herself what that meant. She had learned not to ask the garden to explain itself, but let's say this is a sign of blooming hope. She found her sons in the training yard that afternoon, Kieran and Redoc working through a drill under the eye of one of the household guard, wooden blades meeting in a rhythm that had clearly been practiced longer than either of them would admit. She watched from the edge of the yard for a moment before Kieran noticed her. He lowered his blade immediately. "Walk with me," she said. Redoc opened his mouth, likely to ask whether he was included, and closed it again when she gave him a look that answered the question before he'd finished forming it. Kieran fell into step beside her, and they moved toward the low wall at the yard's edge, out of earshot of the guard, though not quite out of Rydoc's, who continued his drill with noticeably less focus than before. "I went to Everwind," she started, "to secure an alliance." "I heard." "For you." Kieran was quiet for a moment, turning the wooden blade over once in his hand before setting it against the wall. "For the succession," he said, "in case father—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Yes." She told him the rest plainly. The letter, the audience, Logan's questions, the case she'd built, and the case that had unraveled in front of her while she was still trying to defend it. She did not soften any of it, and she found, telling it to her son in the open air of a training yard rather than the careful language of a council chamber, that the story sounded different out loud than it had in her own head. Kieran listened the way Logan had listened, without interrupting, though his jaw tightened somewhere in the middle of it. in a way that told her he understood more than he was saying. "I've watched it happen," he said, when she finished. "Between you and Father. Longer than you probably think I have." He looked out toward the yard, not at her. "I always assumed it was mine to fix. That if I became king, it would settle something. Correct something. That's not why you should take a crown. I know that now." He turned to face her fully. "But I don't think it's mine to take it all. Not because I'm not ready. I could be ready, given time." He paused, choosing the next words with a care that reminded her, uncomfortably, of his father at his best, before the years had worn that carefulness down into something else. "I think it was always supposed to be yours. I think everyone just agreed not to say it." She felt something behind her ribs go very still. "That's not an easy thing to say to your mother," she managed. "It's not," he agreed. "It's easier than watching you keep pretending you don't already know it." "Whatever it is," Riddoch called from across the yard, not even pretending he hadn't been listening. "I'm with you both." Kieran huffed something close to a laugh. "You don't even know what it is. Doesn't matter." Riddoch crossed toward them, blade still in hand, entirely unbothered by his own lack of information. "If it's important enough for the two of you to whisper about by the wall, it's important enough for me to already agree with it. Saves time." "That's not how agreeing with things works," Kieran said. "It's exactly how it works. I've been doing it my whole life." Riddoch dropped onto the low wall beside them, grinning in a way that eased something in the air that had gone taut during the last few minutes. "Also, I'm faster with a blade than you, so my opinion should count for more anyway. You are not faster than me." "I absolutely am. Ask the guard." Sophie watched her sons fall for a moment into the easy rhythm of siblings who had spent their whole lives finding their way back to lightness whenever a room grew too heavy to hold, and felt, watching them, something she hadn't expected to feel that day. Not certainty. Not yet. But something steadier than she'd carried north to Everwind and back. "I haven't decided anything," she said, once Riddick's grin had settled and Kieran's attention had returned to her. "Not yet." "I know," Kieran said. "But when you do..." He glanced once at his brother, who nodded before he'd even finished the thought. "We're already on your side, whichever way you choose to stand." Chapter 2. She returned to Everwind within the month, this time by her own choice rather than necessity, though she told herself, packing for the journey, that there was still business enough to justify it. Logan had offered to review Embermere's succession law more closely, to understand exactly what would be required if she chose the path he'd laid in front of her. That was reason enough. It did not need to be more than that. She found him in a smaller room this time, not the formal hall, but something closer to a study, its long table already covered in ledgers and old treaties by the time she arrived. "I hope you don't mind starting without the ceremony," he said, not looking up from the page in front of him. "I'd prefer it." They worked through the afternoon in a rhythm she hadn't expected, Logan tracing the language of old alliance treaties while she cross-referenced Embermere's succession statutes, both of them building, piece by piece, an argument that would hold if it ever needed to. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. Somewhere in the second hour, she realized she had stopped bracing for the moment he would grow impatient with the detail of it, because that moment never came. "Your father's court kept remarkably thorough records," he said, holding up a ledger from 6 generations back. "This is either a credit to Embermere's clerks, or a testament to how little anyone trusted each other. Both, historically. That tracks." He turned the page. "There's a decree here from your great-grandmother requiring any treaty signed in the throne room to also be read aloud, in full, before witnesses, no exceptions." She didn't trust written contracts. She trusted people even less, apparently. He glanced up. "I like her already." Sophie found herself, unexpectedly, smiling at that. A real one, unguarded, gone before she'd fully registered it had happened. It had been a long time since anyone had made her laugh over a stack of legal documents. It had, she realized, been a long time since anyone had made her laugh at all, without her noticing the effort behind it. She once had an entire delegation from Duskrain wait 3 days for an audience, Sophie said, because she didn't like the wording of their opening letter. Formidable. Insufferable by most accounts. My father adored her. I imagine you take after her. I imagine I'm supposed to be offended by that. You're not, though. He said it without looking up, entirely certain, and she found she had no argument to offer against it, because he was right. They worked past the point where the light through the tall windows shifted from afternoon gold into something dimmer, a servant eventually appearing to light the room's lamps without either of them quite noticing the hour had turned. Logan set down his pen at some point and simply watched her work for a moment, an old treaty half read in her hands, before she caught him at it. What? Nothing. He picked the pen back up. You look like someone who's enjoying this. I am, she admitted, and was faintly surprised to hear herself say it plainly, without qualifying it, without immediately turning the sentence into something smaller and safer. I don't think I've enjoyed anything like this in longer than I'd like to admit. Then we should do it again. It wasn't a declaration. It landed as simply as everything else he said, an observation offered without weight, and yet she felt it settle somewhere she hadn't expected a stack of old treaties to reach. I'd like that, she said. By the time she left Everwind 2 days later, she had not resolved the question Logan had put in front of her the first time she'd stood in his hall. But she left carrying something she hadn't carried north with her the first time. Not certainty, not yet, but the unfamiliar, quietly startling sense that she had spent an entire afternoon being herself, without once needing to be anyone's queen, anyone's mother, anyone's wife, to be worth someone's full attention. She returned to Embermere still carrying the warmth of Everwind, and lost most of it within a day. The court had gathered for the autumn accounting, a routine session, the kind Sophie had presided over for most of her adult life, tallying the season's harvest against the Treasury's needs before the colder months made travel and trade more difficult. She arrived expecting the familiar rhythm of it. She found Mariska already seated at the table, in the chair that had been Sophie's own for longer than the young woman had likely been alive. No one had told her the seating had changed. No one, she suspected, had thought it required telling. Lady Mariska has been assisting with the household accounts, Malcolm said, when Sophie's silence made an explanation unavoidable. Given the demands on your time lately, it seemed practical. I wasn't aware my time had been unusually demanded. Your travels, he said, in a tone that made the word sound smaller than it was. Everwind, wasn't it? Twice now. He knew then. Of course he knew. She had not gone to any great lengths to hide it, had not imagined she needed to. The succession was a legitimate concern for any queen mother to raise with a neighboring crown, and she had built her case, at least on paper, around exactly that legitimacy. But something in the careful lightness of his voice told her he had drawn his own conclusions about the nature of those visits, and had decided, in his own quiet way, to answer them. Mariska did not look up from the ledger in front of her. She kept her eyes on the numbers with the studied focus of someone who had been coached, Sophie thought again, on exactly how much attention was safe to show. The session proceeded. Sophie contributed where she could, though she found her usual observations arriving a beat late, absorbed a moment too long into the discomfort of watching someone else's hand move through figures that had been hers to correct for a decade. Twice, Mariska offered a calculation before Sophie could reach for it herself. Accurate, competently done, delivered in a voice pitched carefully soft, deferential enough to avoid the appearance of overstepping while overstepping regardless. By the session's end, it was no longer a question of whether the court understood what was happening. It was only a question of how quickly they would stop pretending otherwise. Sophie found Kieran afterward, in the corridor outside the accounting hall. and did not need to say anything for him to read the whole of it on her face. "He's moving faster than I expected," she vented out. "He's testing how much the court will accept without objection," Kieran completed. "That's what this is. Not affection, arithmetic." "I know." "Then you know what happens if no one answers it." She did know. She had spent most of her life understanding exactly how quickly a silence could calcify into an agreement, how a room's failure to object became eventually indistinguishable from consent. She had watched it happen to her own chair at the council table. She had no illusions about how quickly it could happen to the rest of what remained hers, if she let the question sit for another season, the way she had let so many others sit before it. "I need to go back to Everwind," she said, more to herself than to him. Kieran didn't argue. He only nodded, the way he had in the training yard, the quiet certainty of a son who had already decided which side of this he stood on, long before his mother had finished deciding for herself. She arrived at Everwind 3 days after the accounting session, having sent no letter ahead of her, only a rider to announce she was coming. Logan met her at the gates himself, and whatever he read on her face in that first moment was enough that he did not ask her immediately what had happened. "Walk with me," he said instead, echoing without knowing it the exact words she'd used with Kieran weeks before. He led her through a part of the castle grounds she hadn't seen on her previous visits. An open garden along the western wall, less formal than the manicured courtyards near the hall. Roses climbing along a low stone border in a white so pale it seemed to hold its own light even under the gray coastal sky. "They only bloom this time of year," Logan said, noticing her attention. "My mother planted the first of them. I've never had the heart to let the gardeners replace them with something easier to keep alive. They're beautiful. They're stubborn," he said. "Half the staff thinks I keep them out of sentiment. The other half thinks I simply forgot to give the order to remove them 15 years ago. Which is it? Does it matter?" She almost smiled. It was, she realized, the first almost smile she'd managed since the accounting hall. They walked the length of the border in a silence that didn't ask anything of her, and it was several minutes before she found the words for what had brought her back so soon. She told him about Mariska's chair, about the ledger, the careful deference, the arithmetic Kieran had named so plainly in the corridor. She told him finally, what she had not quite let herself say aloud until she was standing in front of him, that some nights, lately, it felt easier to simply let it happen. To let the chair, the ledger, the room itself, go to whoever wanted it badly enough to take it. Logan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he didn't offer the comfort she'd half expected, the reassurance, the outrage on her behalf, the easy anger that would have cost him nothing and given her something to lean against. "Would you give up?" he asked instead. "If you were still fighting for Kieran?" The question caught her off guard, the way his questions tended to. "No," she said without needing to think about it. "Never." "Never," he repeated after her, and continued. "Not even on the worst days? Not even when it would have been easier?" "No," she said again without hesitation. "Then why would you give up on you?" he finally completed, what he was meant to say. She had no answer ready. She stood among his mother's white roses, with the question settling into her the way his first question had, weeks ago, in a room full of maps. Not as an accusation, but as something far more difficult to sit with. A mirror held up at exactly the angle she'd spent her whole life avoiding. "It's not the same," she said finally, though even as she said it, she wasn't certain she believed it. "Isn't it?" He turned to face her fully. "You'd burn down half a kingdom for your sons without a second thought. I've watched you do it, quietly, for weeks now. But the moment the fight is for yourself, you start looking for reasons to stop. I'm not looking for reasons to stop. You came here to tell me you were considering it." She opened her mouth to argue and found, again, that the argument wasn't there. He was right. and some old, exhausted part of her recognized the relief of finally being told so by someone who wasn't asking anything of her in return for the honesty. "I don't know how to want something for myself," she admitted. "I'm not sure I ever learned how." "Then let this be the thing you learn it on." The wind moved through the white roses, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them entirely unlike the silences she'd grown used to at Embermere. Not the silence of a room that had stopped accounting for her, but something closer to a held breath, waiting to see what she would do with what he'd just handed her. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked. "My throne, my choice, any of it." Logan considered the question longer than she expected. "Because I've watched capable people talk themselves out of what's theirs for most of my life. And because, selfishly, I'd rather know the version of you that isn't spending all her strength convincing herself she doesn't deserve it." It was not a declaration. It landed, as everything he said tended to, with a plainness that made it harder to dismiss than any grand gesture would have. "I'll think on it," she said, properly this time. "That's all I'm asking." She left the white roses behind her that evening, but she found, riding south the next morning, that his question had traveled with her in a way none of the others had. Not as a wound, but as something closer to a splinter finally worked loose, small and sharp and impossible now to ignore. There was no business reason for the fourth visit, and for the first time, neither of them pretended otherwise. Logan met her not in the hall or the study this time, but at the stables, 2 horses already saddled and waiting. "I thought we might see the coast properly," he suggested, "instead of arguing over treaties in a room with no windows worth looking through." They rode along the cliffs above Everwind's shoreline for the better part of an hour, the wind pulling at everything not fastened down, the sea below them churning gray-green against pale rock. Sophie had not ridden like this in years. Not toward anywhere. Not for any purpose beyond the riding itself. And she felt something in her chest loosen with each mile that put the castle further behind them. They came to a stretch of open beach where the cliffs gave way to sand, and Logan slowed his horse without needing to say why. They dismounted together, leading the horses by the rein along the tide line, hooves sinking soft into the wet sand where the last wave had reached and pulled back. "My wife loved this stretch," Logan said, after a while, without preamble. "She used to say the whole kingdom made more sense from down here than it ever did from the hall." Sophie glanced at him. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on the water, on some point past the horizon that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with it. "You don't have to tell me about her if you don't want to." "I want to," he said. "I don't get many chances to. People assume it's a wound that shouldn't be touched. Mostly it's just a fact of my life. One I'd like someone to know, if I'm going to keep spending my afternoons with them." She let the silence hold the space he needed. He told her, unhurried, about a woman named Evelyn, gone 8 years now, taken by a fever no physician in Everwind had been able to name in time. He told her about the years after. Not dramatic ones, he said. Just quiet, difficult ones. Learning to be a father and a king at the same time with half the household still expecting him to fall apart, and the other half needing him not to. "I didn't remarry because I was looking for a replacement. I want to be clear about that. I remarried." He stopped, corrected himself, something almost like a laugh catching in his throat. "I would remarry, if it happened, because I know now what it costs to carry a kingdom alone. I'm not interested in doing it twice." Sophie found herself, in turn, telling him things she hadn't said aloud to anyone. Not to Kieran, not to the garden, not even fully to herself. About the early years with Malcolm, which had been good, genuinely good, before the good had worn thin under the weight of a crown he'd never quite believed was fully earned. About the specific loneliness of being married to someone who had stopped seeing her as a person somewhere along the way, and started seeing her only as a fixture, reliable, useful, no longer requiring attention. "I don't think he set out to become unkind," she said. "I think he simply stopped noticing me. And cruelty grew in the space that left behind. Logan nodded, unsurprised. That's usually how it happens. The dramatic kind of unkindness is rare. Most of it is just neglect, given enough time to calcify. They walked until the tide crept close enough to threaten the horses' hooves, and then, without either of them quite deciding it, they mounted again and let the animals run. A hard, clean gallop along the firm sand near the waterline, the wind loud enough to swallow conversation entirely. Sophie laughed. Once, unguarded. The sound startled out of her by nothing more than the speed and the salt air, and the sheer relief of a body moving fast enough to outrun its own thoughts. She left Everwind that evening lighter than she had arrived, in a way that had nothing to do with the succession, or the throne, or anything she had come north originally to secure. The garden did not welcome her the way it usually did. She noticed it the moment she entered. The same roses, the same familiar path. And yet something in the air held itself differently. A stillness that felt less like peace, and more like held breath. She had come straight from the road, still in her traveling clothes, carrying the day's warmth from Everwind's coastline, like something she wanted to set down gently in the one place that had always known how to hold things for her. Tonight, walking the path, she found she could not see it. Not truly. The roses were there. She knew they were there, could name their color, their shape, the particular curve of the stone bench waiting at the path's end, and yet none of it reached her the way it always had. She walked its length without stopping, without sitting, without the pull that had drawn her here through every difficult season of her life. Samkiel appeared partway down the path, falling into step beside her, rather than settling against her side the way he usually did. He did not ask anything of her. He simply walked her to the garden's gate and stopped there, watching as she passed through it without looking back. She did not understand, that night, what had shifted. She only knew that something in her had outgrown, at least for now, what the garden alone could offer, that whatever she needed next would not be found sitting still among roses that had already given her everything they knew how to give. Sophie knew this would not be simple. Nothing about reclaiming a throne quietly seated over years could be undone by a single conversation, a single ally, a single well-argued case. But she was done waiting for circumstance to hand her what had always been hers to claim. And if she meant to do this, she would do it the only way she knew how, methodically, one careful conversation at a time, with nothing left to chance that could be secured through precision instead. She began with Keswick, because Keswick had been the first to look away, and she suspected that made him the first who might be persuaded to look back. She found him not in the council chamber, but in his own study, off the east corridor, surrounded by the ledgers he kept with a precision that had made him useful to 3 different administrations, without ever quite belonging to any of them. He rose when she entered, fully, without hesitation, the old courtesy intact when there was no larger room to perform it for. "Your Majesty, I'd like to speak plainly, if you're willing to hear it that way." He gestured her to a seat, some old wariness moving behind his eyes. "I'm always willing to listen." She did not waste the opening. She told him what she had told no one at Embermere yet. Not the shape of a plan, not fully, but the direction of one. That she no longer intended to stand behind Malcolm's negligence and wait for it to correct itself. That Kieran's claim, however legitimate, was not the one she intended to spend the rest of her strength defending. That her own claim, the one running through 6 generations of Embermere blood rather than through a marriage, had never actually gone anywhere, no matter how thoroughly the court had agreed to stop naming it. Keswick was totally quiet for a long moment after she finished. "You understand what you're asking," he said finally. "Not for support. For men to stand against a king they've served for 25 years. I understand exactly what I'm asking. And if it fails, then it fails," she said. "But I'd rather fail having asked than succeed at nothing by staying silent." He studied her the way he might study a column of figures that didn't yet balance, not with suspicion, but with the particular attention of a man deciding how much weight a new number could bear. "You were the first to notice the tariffs were wrong," he said, eventually. "Years ago, before anyone else at that table had read past the summary." "I remember. I've thought about that more than you'd guess this past year, watching the chair change hands." He set down his pen. "I won't promise you the council. I can't. But I'll tell you honestly what I think. And I think you're the only person in this castle who's read the ledgers thoroughly enough to actually run it." It wasn't a pledge. It was, she understood, something more valuable than a pledge made too quickly. The beginning of a man reconsidering, out loud, a silence he'd been keeping out of habit rather than conviction. She left his study and spent the following days in a slow, careful accumulation of conversations much like it. Lord Aldrich, harder to move, unwilling to commit to anything beyond a non-committal nod. Two of the younger lords, more receptive than she expected, having watched the last year's erosion with a discomfort they'd simply lacked the standing to voice on their own. She kept no tally where anyone could see it. She kept it, instead, in the careful arithmetic she'd always been good at, the kind Malcolm had stopped noticing her doing. He noticed this. He found her in the eastern corridor near the end of the week, alone, his expression carrying none of the easy indifference of the last several months. "You've been busy," he said. "I have. Keswick came to me today with an unusual number of questions about succession law." "Did he?" "Sophie." Her name, spoken plainly, without title, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Something in it almost sounded like the man she'd married. "Whatever this is me," she said, no longer standing behind negligence and calling it patience. He studied her carefully, and she watched something shift behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the first flicker of a man recalculating a position he had assumed, for 25 years, was permanently secure. "You'd need the council," he said. "Most of it. You'd need more than a handful of half-convinced lords and a foreign king's goodwill. I know what I'd need. And if you don't get it, then you'll have lost nothing," she said, "and I'll have lost only what I was already losing by staying quiet." He didn't answer that. He simply watched her walk past him down the corridor, and she felt, for the first time since the hall 3 chapters and half a lifetime ago, that the ground beneath both of them had finally, undeniably, begun to move. Malcolm moved faster than she expected, though she supposed she should have anticipated it. A man who had spent years mistaking silence for loyalty would not, faced finally with its absence, respond with patience. The first sign came within days. Mariska's presence at council sessions, previously informal, was formalized, a seat assigned, a title invented for the occasion, advisor to the crown on household affairs, vague enough to mean whatever the room needed it to mean, and specific enough to make her removal later look like a demotion rather than a correction. Sophie understood the message immediately. He was not simply defending Mariska's place. He was building a structure around her fast enough that unbuilding it would cost more than anyone currently on the fence would be willing to pay. She went to Keswick again, and found him more cautious than their first meeting, not retreating, but weighing, the way a man weighs a decision that has stopped being theoretical. "He's spoken to several of us," Keswick admitted. "Not threats, nothing so clumsy. Reminders, of appointments made, of favors extended, of what continuity has historically been worth to this court. And I told him continuity isn't worth much to a court that's stopped functioning honestly." He didn't look pleased with himself for saying it. He looked like a man who understood the cost of the sentence even as he spoke it. "But I won't pretend every lord in this castle shares my patience for principle over comfort." Lord Aldrich, when she approached him again, was blunter. "I have no quarrel with you, Your Majesty. I have a quarrel with instability. A contested crown is a vulnerable one, and a vulnerable crown makes for a vulnerable border. Duskrain has never needed much invitation to test Embermere's edges." Duskrain is Malcolm's own house, she said. If anything, my claim strengthens that border, not weakens it. My son sits well with Everwind. I sit well with the law itself. Perhaps. He did not commit further. She left his hall understanding that perhaps was, for now, the best answer available, and that pushing harder would only calcify the doubt rather than dissolve it. The pressure found its sharpest edge 3 days later, when Malcolm summoned her, not to the council chamber, but to the same private study where, years ago, they had once reviewed the kingdom's affairs together as something close to partners. "I know what you're doing," he said without preamble. "I imagine you do. You're asking me to believe you'd tear this court in half over a chair. I'm asking nothing of you. I stopped asking things of you some time ago. You simply haven't been paying close enough attention to notice when it happened." Something in his composure cracked, briefly, into something rawer than the careful indifference he'd worn for months. 25 years, Sophie. I built this kingdom standing with you. I don't understand what you think you're proving by tearing it apart now. You didn't build it, and kept her voice level, because raising it would have given him something to respond to that wasn't the truth. You inherited a seat at a table I was born to, and somewhere along the way you convinced yourself the table existed because of you. He didn't answer that. She watched him search, visibly, for the version of the argument that would land the way his arguments had always landed with her, assured, faintly condescending, certain of its own reasonableness. And watched him fail to find it, perhaps for the first time in longer than either of them could name. "What do you actually want?" he asked finally. Not a challenge. Something closer, despite himself, to an honest question. "What was always mine," she said. "Nothing more than that, and nothing less." She left him standing in the study that had once been theirs, and did not look back to see what his face did once the door had closed behind her. She had, she realized, walking the corridor toward whatever came next, stopped needing to know. By the week's end, the court had split cleanly enough that pretending otherwise served no one. Keswick and the 2 younger lords stood, cautiously, at her side. Aldrich and a handful of others remained with Malcolm, whether from loyalty or fear of instability, she couldn't fully separate. The rest waited, the way courts always waited, to see which ground would hold before committing their weight to it. It was not a victory. It was not yet anything at all. But it was, for the first time since the hall where this had all begun, an argument being fought in the open, with nothing left standing quietly in the dark to be overlooked. Chapter 3. The council summoned Kieran directly, 3 days after the corridor confrontation. An unusual request, but not an unreasonable one, given that half the room still assumed the argument being fought was, at its foundation, about him. Sophie had not asked him to attend. She had, if anything, hoped to spare him the particular exposure of a formal hearing before he was ready for it, if he was ever going to be ready for anything of the kind. But Kieran had insisted, quietly, and without room for negotiation, and she had learned over the past several weeks not to mistake her son's calm for a lack of resolve. The chamber was fuller than usual. Keswick sat near the front, flanked by the 2 younger lords who had, with visible discomfort, made their allegiance plain. Aldrich sat opposite, his expression carefully unreadable. Malcolm occupied the seat he had occupied for years, and Mariska, in her newly formalized capacity, sat close enough beside him that no one in the room could pretend not to notice the positioning. "The council has called this session," Aldrich began, "to address a matter of succession that has, in recent weeks, become impossible to leave unaddressed. Specifically," he glanced, not unkindly, toward Kieran, "to hear directly from the young man whose claim has been so frequently invoked on all sides of this dispute." Kieran rose. Sophie watched him do it with the same steadiness he'd carried since the training yard, since the wall where he'd told her, plainly, what he believed to be true, before she'd been ready to hear it. "I appreciate the council's confidence," he said, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding about what I actually believe, and I'd like to correct it now, in front of everyone, so there's no more confusion for anyone to hide behind." The room went still, like they could sense the script they'd prepared for was about to be discarded. "For most of my life," Kieran said, "I assumed that if this day came, if my father's rule ever became something the kingdom needed to move past, that the crown would come to me, not because I wanted it, because that's simply how everyone around me had always spoken of it. The son inherits. That was the whole of the reasoning I was ever given, and I never once questioned whether the reasoning was sound." He paused, and Sophie saw him find her, briefly, in the crowd. Not for permission, she understood, but for steadiness, the way a person glances toward solid ground before stepping onto something less certain. "I've questioned it since," he continued. "Embermere's line has never run through marriage. It runs through blood, and it always has, 6 generations deep, long before my father ever set foot in this hall. My mother is that blood. I am 1 generation removed from it, on loan, so to speak, through a lineage that only exists because of her in the first place." He let that settle before he went on. "I would make a serviceable king, in time, with the right guidance. I don't say that with false modesty, but a serviceable king was never what this kingdom needed. It needed the ruler it already had, sitting quietly at the wrong end of the table for 25 years, while everyone in this room agreed not to look directly at her." Malcolm's expression had not moved, but something in his stillness had changed register, the specific tension of a man watching an argument he had not prepared for arrive from a direction he hadn't guarded. "I withdraw any claim I have to this throne," Kieran said, "not because I lack the will for it, but because it was never mine to accept in the first place. If the council is looking for the rightful ruler of Embermere, I'd suggest you stop looking at me and start looking at the woman who's been running this kingdom in every way that matters for longer than most of you have held your seats." The silence that followed was unlike any Sophie had sat inside since the night of the hall, months ago now, when a woman in blue had walked its length and the room had gone quiet around her instead. This silence did not feel like erasure. It felt for the first time like the room recalculating around a truth it could no longer avoid. Aldrich was the one who finally spoke. "That's a significant renunciation, young man. I hope you understand the weight of it." "I understand it completely," Kieran said. "I've had a long time to think about it." He returned to his seat beside her without another word, and Sophie reached over, once, briefly, to rest her hand over his. Not for the room to see, though she suspected several of them did anyway, but because there was nothing else in that moment. She knew how to say to him that wouldn't diminish what he'd just done by trying to dress it in more words than it needed. The council did not resolve anything further that day, but something in the chamber had shifted its weight permanently, the way ground shifts once a fault line finally moves, and everyone present understood, walking out into the corridor afterward, that the question they'd all be forced to answer next was no longer whether, but when. The full assembly convened 8 days later, in the great hall where this had all begun. The same stone, the same tall windows, the same seats arranged in the same order they had occupied for generations, though nothing about the room felt unchanged. Every noble house of Embermere had been summoned, not merely the council. Envoys had arrived from Duskrain, watching with the careful neutrality of a house that had its own reasons to prefer one outcome over another. A rider had come from Everwind as well, though Logan himself had not, a decision Sophie understood without needing it explained. This was not his to stand inside. It was hers to walk through alone. She wore no crown. She had decided that carefully, the night before. Nothing borrowed, nothing claimed in advance of the room's judgment. Only the deep formal blue of Embermere's own house colors, the ones that had draped the hall on the day of her own wedding, 25 years and a lifetime ago. Malcolm stood at the head of the chamber when she entered, Mariska seated near enough to be visible, far enough to avoid the appearance of a formal position she had not yet been granted. He watched Sophie cross the length of the hall with an expression that had, over the past weeks, stopped pretending toward indifference. Whatever this was between them now, it had stopped being something either of them could look away from. Aldrich opened the session, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood, finally, that history would remember exactly how this room chose to conduct itself today. The council recognizes that a formal petition has been raised regarding the fitness of the current crown and the rightful succession of Embermere. We will hear the petition in full before any vote is called. Every eye in the chamber turned to Sophie. She had prepared this moment more carefully than any negotiation of her life, and yet, standing at last inside it, she found the preparation mattered less than she'd expected. The words did not need rehearsing anymore. They had been true for longer than she'd been willing to say them. I stand before this council, not to ask for mercy on my husband's behalf, and not to ask for indulgence on my own. I stand here to state plainly what every person in this hall has known, in some quiet corner of themselves, for a great many years. She let her gaze move across the room. Keswick, steady. Aldrich, listening without yet revealing his judgment. The Duskgrain envoys, careful and unreadable. Malcolm, still as stone. Embermere's crown was never his to inherit. It came to him through marriage, and it has been sustained every year since, by a court willing to overlook how thoroughly he has forgotten that fact. I do not say this out of bitterness. I say it because a kingdom cannot continue indefinitely governed by a man who has confused the privilege of a seat for the right to it. A murmur moved through the hall, quickly stilled. I am not asking this council for clemency toward what has happened these past months, she continued. I am not asking for a gentler correction or a quiet compromise that allows everyone in this room to return to comfortable silence once the matter has passed. I am asking for his removal, full, formal, and permanent. And I am asking this council to recognize what has always been true beneath every treaty this kingdom has signed for 6 generations, that the throne of Embermere answers to its own blood, not to whoever happens to be standing beside it. The silence that followed was absolute and deep. Malcolm found his voice before anyone else in the room found theirs. You'd destroy 25 years over pride. I'd correct 25 years, Sophie said, over truth. There's a difference, though I understand why you've never needed to learn it. Aldrich rose slowly. The council will vote, as is proper. But I will say, before any hand is raised, that I have sat at this table longer than most in this room, and I have never once, in all that time, seen a claim presented with less need for embellishment. The truth of it stood on its own. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. 2 lords remained loyal to Malcolm out of a conviction Sophie suspected ran deeper than politics. Old friendships, old debts, the kind of loyalty that did not bend simply because the ground beneath it had shifted. But the weight of the chamber moved decisively, irreversibly, in the only direction the truth had ever actually pointed. Malcolm was stripped of the crown before the session's end. The formal instruments of his rule surrendered under the eyes of the same court that had once risen for him without question. He did not look at Sophie again before he was escorted from the hall. She found, watching him go, that she had expected to feel something larger than she did. Triumph, perhaps, or the sharp satisfaction of a debt finally collected. What she felt instead was quieter and stranger, and far more like relief. The same relief of a door closing on a room she had spent half her life standing inside without ever being fully seen. The hall remained standing long after he'd gone, waiting, watching her with the unmistakable attention of a room that understood exactly what question it was now required to answer. The formal dissolution of the marriage took less time than the marriage itself had ever required to unravel. A morning in the council chamber, a handful of signatures, the same clerks who had once recorded the terms of a wedding now recording the terms of its ending, in a tone so administrative it was almost merciful. Malcolm signed without argument. Whatever fight had remained in him had left the hall the day the vote was cast, and what stood before her now was a man who understood, finally and completely, the size of what he had lost by never once measuring it correctly. Duskgrain will take you back. It was not a question. They'll have to. Something almost like a bitter laugh moved through him. I imagine there's a certain irony in that, ending where I started. There's no irony in it. It's simply where your claim was always going to lead, once it stopped being propped up by mine. He looked at her then. Really looked, for what she suspected was the first time in longer than either of them wanted to count. I did love you, in the beginning. I want you to know that survived whatever else didn't. I believe you. She found, saying it, that she meant it. I think you loved me for exactly as long as it required no sacrifice of your comfort to keep doing it. That's not nothing. It's also not enough to build 25 years on. He had no answer for that. He left Embermere 3 days later, a modest procession carrying him north toward Duskrain, and the life he had once been so certain he'd outgrown, and Sophie did not go to the gate to watch him leave. She had said what needed saying. The rest belonged to him now, not to her. She found Mariska in the Eastern Gardens 2 days after that. Not her garden, the one behind the wall that answered to no one but itself, but the ordinary formal courtyard near the guest quarters, where the young woman sat alone on a stone bench with the particular stillness of someone who had run out of places she was welcome to go. I imagine you weren't expecting me, Sophie kindly said. Mariska rose too quickly, some old instinct toward deference not yet worn away by the past week's collapse. Your Majesty, I didn't think... She stopped. I don't know what I thought. Sit, please. Mariska sat, warily, and Sophie took the space beside her, close enough to talk plainly, far enough to leave the younger woman room to breathe. I don't hate you, she began. I want to say that clearly, because I suspect you've spent this week assuming otherwise, and I'd rather not let you carry an assumption that isn't true. Mariska's composure, so carefully maintained through every council session Sophie had watched her sit through, finally cracked. He left this morning. He didn't ask if I was coming. He didn't ask anything at all. No, I don't imagine he did. I have nowhere to go. My family... She caught herself, some old caution reasserting itself even now. It doesn't matter. I made my choices. I understand what they've cost. You made choices inside a situation a much older, much more powerful man arranged for his own benefit. That doesn't erase your part in it. Sophie held her gaze steadily. But I've lived a long time watching this court decide who deserves grace and who doesn't, based on very little beyond whoever's easiest to blame in a given season. I'm not interested in continuing this odd tradition. Mariska looked at her, uncertain, as though waiting for the condition that would make the kindness make sense. I'm not offering you a place at court. Sophie let the boundary land plainly, because she suspected the girl needed it stated as clearly as the offer itself. You won't sit at that table. You won't be asked to advise on anything beyond what you're genuinely capable of advising on. But I've seen the ledger work you did, whatever the circumstances that put you in that chair. It was competent. More than competent in places. Embermere's household accounts have needed a steady hand for longer than I've had time to give them one directly. The position is yours if you want it, not as a favor, as a job you've already shown you can do. Why would you do this? Because punishing you further wouldn't return anything to me that I've lost. And because I'd rather build something in this kingdom than spend what's left of my strength making sure everyone who wronged me suffers precisely as much as I once did. Sophie rose, smoothing her skirts, already turning toward the path. That's not the queen I intend to be. Mariska was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the courtyard's modest fountain rather than on Sophie. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't need to thank me. You need to do the work well. That will be thanks enough. She left the courtyard without waiting for a further response, and found, walking back toward the hall that was now, undeniably, entirely her own, that the decision had cost her nothing she minded losing. Justice, she was beginning to understand, was not the same instrument as vengeance. One built. The other only ever emptied the hand that wielded it. The coronation was set for the first clear morning after the harvest moon, and Embermere had not seen a ceremony of this scale in longer than most of the court could remember. Sophie stood in the antechamber off the great hall as the final preparations moved around her. Attendants adjusting the fall of her gown, deep Embermere blue, unadorned by anything that hadn't belonged to the house for generations. No borrowed jewels, no ornament chosen to impress a foreign court. She had asked, specifically, for the plainest crown in the vault to be restored and polished rather than commissioning something new. The same slender circlet her own mother had worn, and her mother's mother before that, 6 generations of Embermere women who had, in one way or another, understood exactly what it meant to carry this weight without needing to announce it. Kieran found her there in the last few minutes before the doors were due to open, dressed for the ceremony himself, Redoc trailing a step behind him with none of his usual restlessness for once. "You look terrified," Redoc said, with the young bluntness she'd come to expect from him. "I am, a little." "Good," Kieran said. "I'd trust it less if you weren't." She reached for both of their hands, one in each of hers, and held them a moment longer than the occasion strictly required. "Whatever happens beyond these doors," she said, "the two of you are the reason any of it was worth doing." "We know," Redoc said, and for once said nothing further to undercut the sincerity of it. The doors opened, and she walked the length of the great hall alone. The chamber was full in a way she had never seen it. Every noble house, every envoy, the entire weight of a kingdom's attention gathered in one place and turned finally and completely toward her. She found Keswick near the front, Aldrich beside him, the old divisions of the council session already beginning to soften into something closer to unified attention. She found Logan seated among the visiting dignitaries, not at the front, not beside her path, exactly where he'd told her he intended to be. Present, visible, and entirely without claim on the moment unfolding in front of him. He caught her eye once as she passed, and did not smile exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that told her, without a single word, that he understood precisely what this moment cost, and what it meant, and that he had no intention of taking a single inch of it for himself. She reached the dais and turned to face the hall. Aldrich performed the rites himself, his voice carrying the full weight of the office, and Sophie found, standing there, that the ceremony's ancient language, words she had heard spoken over her husband a lifetime ago, standing beside him rather than at the center of them, settled onto her shoulders not as something borrowed, but as something finally returned to its rightful place. "Do you accept the crown of Embermere?" Aldrich said, "and with it, the full weight of its throne, its people, and its law?" "I do," Sophie said, "not as anyone's wife, not as anyone's regent. As the blood this kingdom has always answered to, whether or not it said so aloud." The crown settled onto her head, light as memory, heavier than anything she had ever carried. The hall rose to Queen Sophie Emberere. All of it, every lord, every envoy, every servant pressed along the walls the way they had been pressed on the day this had all begun, in another lifetime, in this same room. They rose the way they had once risen automatically, without thought, before a room had quietly decided to stop. Except this time the rising was not habit. It was choice, offered freely to a woman who had finally stopped waiting to be given what had always been hers. Kieran and Redoc stood nearest the dais, and beside them, though no one had asked him to be, Samkiel sat at the base of the steps, tail curled neatly around his paws, watching the ceremony with the stillness of something that had known. Long before anyone else in the hall had let themselves believe it, exactly how this story was always going to end. Sophie looked out at the room that had once gone silent around her, and did not look away. Some months had passed since the coronation, enough for the court to settle into its new rhythm, enough for the kingdom's ledgers to reflect a governance steadier than it had been in longer than most could remember. Embermere had grown accustomed by then to a queen who ruled in her own name, and the memory of the hall that had once gone silent around her had begun, slowly, to feel like something that belonged to another era entirely. It was in that quieter season that the wedding took place, in Embermere's great hall, on a morning bright enough that no one thought to comment on the season, though winter was not far off. Sophie wore blue again, a different shade than the coronation gown, warmer, closer to the color of the sky reflected in the harbor at Everwind, than to the formal blue of Embermere's banners. Logan stood at the end of the aisle in the plain, unornamented way she had come to expect of him. No crown of his own on display. No procession built to remind the room of everything he was giving up to stand there. He simply waited, the way he always had, for her to arrive on her own terms. Both courts filled the hall. Embermere's nobles seated alongside Everwind's envoys. The old, careful distance between the two kingdoms dissolved into something that felt, for the first time in either of their histories, less like alliance and more like family. Kieran walked her the length of the aisle, Riddoch close behind, and if either of her sons felt any strangeness in watching their mother marry a second time, neither showed it. They had made their peace with this long before the hall had. The vows were brief, plainly spoken, neither of them inclined toward performance. When Logan took her hand in front of the full weight of both kingdoms, there was no reluctance in it, no calculation, nothing that asked to be measured against what a crown might gain from the union. It was, simply, two people who had found each other honestly, choosing to say so out loud. The hall rose when the vows were finished, not out of obligation, not out of habit reasserting itself, but the way a room rises for something it has genuinely been glad to witness. Later, after the feast had wound down and the last of the guests had drifted toward their own quarters, Sophie slipped away from the hall's warmth and made her way, as she always eventually did, to the garden. Logan found her there without needing to ask where she'd gone. He said nothing when he stepped through the old gate, only crossed to where she stood among the roses, the deep, impossible blue of them, catching what little moonlight reached this far behind the wall. Samkiel was waiting on the path. His fur held that color fully again, vivid, unclouded, the same shade she remembered from her girlhood, from every season before the years had worn it thin. He pressed his weight against her ankle once, briefly, and then settled nearby, content simply to be present for whatever this moment was. "This is the place," Logan said. "You always come to before making a decision." "It is." "Have you made one?" She looked at him, and then at the roses, and then at the quiet dark beyond the wall where the rest of the castle carried on without her for once. "I think I made it a long time ago," she said. "I only needed the rest of my life to catch up to it." He didn't ask what she meant. He simply took her hand, the way he had at the altar, and stood beside her in the one place that had never once asked her to prove she belonged there. They say the blue roses in that garden have never fully explained themselves, and likely never will. They say the cat who lives among them has outlived several queens, and will likely outlive whoever writes his story next. No one has ever managed to give him an age that agreed with anyone else's account, and by now no one much bothers to try. What can be said, with more certainty than any of that, is this. A woman spent a great many years believing her worth was borrowed from someone else's crown, and in the end, walked back into a garden that had never once agreed with her. Some things, it turns out, were never lost at all. They were only waiting to be seen. Thank you for staying with this story until its very last page. Before you go, I have a small question for you. Tonight's telling opened and closed a little differently than usual. The illustrated pages, the ink and parchment, meant to feel like diving directly into the book itself before the story became real around you. I'd love to know what you thought of it. If Sophie's story moved you tonight, consider subscribing to Evelyn's Alpha Romance library so you never miss the next one. With love, Evelyn.